welcome to Counterpunch Radio. My name is Eric Draitzer. Thanks so much for tuning in, coming back to the show. First time listeners finding the show, welcome aboard. Always happy to have you. Have you gone over and gotten your subscription to Counterpunch Plus? If you haven't, now would be a great time. It's the fund drive. We're trying to raise what we need to raise to pay for the web hosting, to keep the lights on, to keep all of the things moving so that Counterpunch can keep publishing as we have for almost 30 years. If you value independent media from the left, from all of these different perspectives, as Counterpunch has been bringing to you, go over to the website, get the subscription, make the donation today. We really appreciate it. And we really appreciate support for independent media and support for left-wing thinkers, left-wing ideas that really do need to be out there. And I'm so happy today to be able to speak with a really important thinker and author who has just published I would say, critical new book that we're going to talk about in a minute. It's Christina Heatherton. She's with us today. Christina is the Elting Associate Professor of American Studies and Human Rights at Trinity College in Connecticut. She's the co-editor of Policing the Planet, Why the Policing Crisis Led to Black Lives Matter. And most importantly, for our purposes today, she is the author of the brand new book, Arise, Global Radicalism in the Era of the Mexican Revolution. Wow, what a book. Christina Heatherton, welcome to Counterpunch.
Thanks so much, Eric. I'm so excited to be here.
Boy, I have to admit, this book was really like, I mean, what do I say without sounding like a cliched guy, like a page turner, I don't know. It was a barn burner, whatever the words are.
Keep
It
them
was really
coming.
great. I couldn't put it down because it's so full of ideas. It's full of more than just history. It's full of ideas. And we want to talk about some of those ideas with you today. Let's talk a little bit about you, if we could put the spotlight on you, make you feel nervous, squirm in your chair a little bit. Tell us a little bit about your background, Christina, specifically your research and what brought you to this project, which we're going to be talking about here this evening.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks so much for having me on, and thanks for the questions. Whew, uh, you're right about the squirming. I'm not always too good with the Christina Heatherton, This Is Your Life. Let me say there's two ways I can answer that question. One is, I suppose, a personal story. My mother's family's Okinawan American, Japanese American, and before the Japanese American internment in World War II, there were FBI raids, and they targeted organizers. And one organizer was my great uncle Morosai Yamashiro, who was a farm worker in the Imperial Valley, California. He was Okinawan, so he could speak Okinawan dialects, Japanese, Spanish, English. And so he was a really well placed organizer in the Imperial Valley. And so the story I heard was that when federal agents came to his door, he was ready to fight back. His son said, quote, since he had been down there with Pancho Villa fighting in the Mexican Revolution, he knew how to take care of business. So if he was going down, he was going to take them down with him. So I was totally shocked by this story. I had been really interested in the history of revolutionary currents of the Atlantic world, the common wind that Julius Scott writes about, and had done a lot of work in kind of that world. I helped start a group called the Radical History Group out of Bristol, England, where we did a lot of events around that history. So initially, I thought I was going to do a kind of revolutionary currents of the Pacific book, and really think about my uncle's story. What did it mean that there were a lot of Okinawans who came to California through Mexico, and some of them did have engagements with the Mexican Revolution. So I was just really kind of thrilled to think, well, what would have been the basis for alliance and solidarity? How would that have even come about? And I'll just say, so that's the kind of the first way in. The other way in is politically. I've always been interested in interconnected global struggles and the question of internationalism. I've done a lot of work around housing, policing, racism, and militarism. I've worked on a lot of different pieces of political and popular education, working with housing organizers in particular. So, Policing the Planet is one of many different kinds of those kind of collections that I've done. And those, have always been about getting people to think about seemingly disparate places and struggles. What sort of alliances and common languages can be developed among them. So, in some ways, this seems like a departure from some of that earlier work. As far as I'm concerned, it's a continuation.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and I couldn't help but think throughout the book about, like, the timeline of all of these things, and in Pancho Villa and the Mexican Revolution, and like a few years later it's the Russian Revolution, and all of these ideas all percolating at the same time, and what's going on in Spain at the same time that what's going on in Mexico and what's going on in Russia. And it's fascinating, and there's so many different threads, and I think that you bring them all together. And I didn't even plan that segue, but since I used the word threads, let me ask you a little bit about rope. That's where the book begins. It's a fascinating. I'm almost. I can't think of another book where I would say, like, spoiler alert for the first page of the book, but like, spoiler alert, there's a really beautiful metaphor that opens this book, and you talk about rope. So tell us a little bit about rope and why the book opens there.
Sure. Well, this was a tricky book to write because I wanted to talk about revolution. I wanted to talk about internationalism, and I wanted to think about it in relationship to the Mexican Revolution, all of which people come with a lot of very fully formed ideas. And so I wanted to be able to give readers a kind of imaginary that they could hold on to for the entire book. And I, also just wanted to defamiliarize the familiar. So every chapter in the book is named after the making of something: how to make love, how to make a dress, how to make a living, how to make a university. And the introduction is called How to Make a Rope. And it's essentially a political economy of 20th century lynch rope. And so, to make a long story short, and like you said, we won't spoil it for the readers. I was totally fascinated in the different composites that produced rope in this period. You had a fiber Filipinos called abaca or manila, which was one of the main exports of that country. You had from southern Mexico sisal and henequen, which are related to the agave plant. You had cotton rope and hemp rope coming from Jim Crow sharecropping regimes. So, I was just really floored thinking about how all these strands came together to produce rope of varying widths and strengths. So there's already a kind of world tied together in the production of this tyrannical instrument. And what I say in the book, ropes, the ligatures of the global economy, materialize the processes by which people around the world have their lives and their fates intertwined. And by unbraiding those strands, we can also begin to see how people understood their struggles in alignment with one another. So, struggles that we might customarily think about as discrete, struggles against colonial dispossession, imperial rule, capitalist immiseration. I think we have a real challenge in our imagination to be able to think about these things together at the same time. And so for me, the rope is a kind of device to pull these things together and to introduce the main concept of the book, which is convergent spaces. Right? How do we begin to understand a world already united? You know. Under global capital, but also how do we understand the compression and the entanglements of different radical traditions and the new articulations of struggle that they produced?
And it's not just about the commodity, it's also about the labor that is required to create the commodity, to produce the thing. So it is simultaneously the thing and the processes that go into the thing, but also the labor and the people, the humans that do the labor. And it's kind of, I mean, it's dialectical in that way.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well,
But I
good. We
do,
agree.
we agree.
I want to ask you a little bit about making. You said, the structure of the book, and that every chapter is, essentially about making. And so, talk a little bit about what you mean by making, because it isn't just the sort of, classical Marxist, economic understanding of production, right? You mean a lot more than just producing.
Well, when you think about global capital, and you think about the totality of capitalism, which includes but also exceeds the realm of production. You have to think about extraction and transportation and refinement and consumption and destruction. The social relations that go into it. There's an entire universe that makes accumulation regimes possible. And so, to think about struggles against global capital, you have to be attendant to, to all of that. and uh, I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Was there a question? I don't even I'm not sure. Okay. The question really is about, what you mean when you say make. And I guess I could flesh
Make.
that out a little bit more and because it's both about making as in producing physical goods, but it's also about making the making of ideas. Internationalism is an idea. The creation of these ties across countries, across language barriers and so forth. It's a process of building solidarity is like building a product.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, there's a lot that I'm doing with some intentionality with the making. The making is obviously a hat tip to E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, and there's a whole world of social history that I see myself very much in dialogue with. Although to be specific, the kind of variant of social history that I see myself coming from is one that doesn't begin with Thompson, but it begins with Du Bois and it begins with James. um, there's a very long history, that people like Marcus Rediker talk about as history from below, right? How do we think about how history has been produced through struggle, through class struggle? Um, and how do we, approach the kind of theoretical and methodological challenges of telling that history? So, uh, you know, making for me is both in a kind of like a very loud acknowledgement in the whole structure of the book that I'm in dialogue with those traditions. But what I get from Du Bois is also an analysis that's enables us to understand contingency. Across all of Du Bois's works, I'm really moved by his idea that if something's made, if you understand how something's made, you understand that it can be unmade. And I think sometimes, particularly when we talk about capital, there's a finality to each of the components. We forget how contingent, how unpredictable, how much a product of struggle the current world is. I think we lose sight of how it's produced in struggle, and how much power we have to continue to change it in struggle. So yeah, I appreciate the question because I think this is it's personally and politically an important concept for me, but it's also something that I wanted to elevate throughout the whole book because all of the different people that I feature, all the different struggles, I think have this in common: the sense of contingency, possibility, and struggle.
Yeah, absolutely, and that does come through in the book, and even just looking at the table of contents, I mean, you can see how that thread comes together. But let's take a step back and pretend for a moment that everyone listening to us doesn't know all the details about the Mexican Revolution, which of course I'm sure they do. They have no need to learn anything about it. But for those who may pretend that they don't know, why don't you help us to remind